Attorney's Office represents the federal government in criminal and civil law cases. These cases don't always involve lawyers, guns, and money, but they often play a role. Today, Dwight Holton, U.S. Attorney for Oregon, will discuss how his office impacts Oregon and its residents. Mr. Holton began his career at the U.S. Department of Justice 13 years ago in Eastern New York, where he focused on the prosecution of violent crimes. In 2002, Governor Kulongoski appointed Mr. Holton to the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission, where he helped implement state sentencing law and set the direction for Oregon criminal justice policy. Mr. Holton joined the U.S. Attorney's Office in Oregon in 2004. There, he prosecuted hundreds of federal cases, including murder, terrorism, and racketeering, among other crimes. Since being appointed U.S. Attorney for the District of Oregon earlier this year, he has led efforts to increase prosecution of environmental crimes and has been serving Oregon's tribal communities as a top priority. I also have to say, on a more personal note, that Mr. Holton is proud to be the father of several young children who will be in a Halloween parade later this afternoon. So we have to be mindful of his time in getting there so he can watch over, I believe, a pink unicorn and a Captain Cody. So on that note, please welcome Mr. Holton.
Good afternoon, and thank you to Melody and to Ted, as well as to Sharon Van Sickle-Robbins and Executive Director Charity Fain for having me here today. And of course, my good friend Steve Novick, who helped set this up. The City Club and, in fact, the Friday Forum are part of the reason that I live here in Oregon. My wife, many of you know my beautiful wife and my best friend for many years now, Mary Ellen Glenn, who has worked here for the governor and before that for President Clinton and Secretary Clinton and Ambassador Holbrooke. We're both lifetime public servants. And we moved here a year ago on an experiment that was supposed to, we moved here for what was supposed to be a one-year experiment about 10 years ago. And I remember very distinctly, right after we moved here in August of 2002, driving home from dinner one night, and we turned to OPB, and here was the City Club Friday Forum. And what we heard was a range of people from students to CEOs. I think you were probably talking about growth or the kicker. I'm sure Novick asked a question. And what we thought was, here's a group of people having a serious and sober conversation about the most complicated public policy issues to make their communities a better place. This is the place for us. And I was reminded of this just a few months ago when I was here to listen to Chief Judge Aiken and Judge Marcus talking about their efforts on reentry programs. You know, Oregon is a place where if you have energy, creativity, and an idea, you can make it a reality. And the City Club and the Friday Forum are an important part of that. And I thank you for helping bring us here and keep us here. If you've ever watched Law and Order, you know the basic script here. In the criminal justice system, the people are represented by two separate and distinct groups: the police who investigate crime and the prosecutors who prosecute the offenders. Dong dong. This is so universally known that when people ask me what I do for a living, I generally tell them I'm the second half of Law and Order. But of course, it's much more complicated than that. You have county prosecutors dealing with city cops. There are county sheriffs, there's state police, there's the attorney general. But then on top of that, there's the entire federal law enforcement system. My office deals with probably 20 different federal law enforcement agencies that range from the FBI to the Fish and Wildlife Service. So the bad news is that it's very complicated. The good news is that the story of our work is interesting because it is about communities. The United States Attorney's Office can and must be an agent for positive change in the community. Our mission, our primary goal, is to make it so regular working people can live their lives without worrying about their elderly parents losing their life savings to a fraudster, without worrying about their kids having to run the gauntlet of drug dealers to get to their school, without worrying that some criminal polluter is going to ruin their safe drinking water forever. We look to get violence and fraud and guns and drugs and environmental pollution out of the way so people can live their lives. And we defend the government when it's sued to try and work towards reasonable and just solutions when there's a challenge to the way we do business or perhaps to the specific acts of our government employee in his or her job. I'm not going to bore you with office metrics, but I will take 30 seconds to give you the basics. We have about 110 people working in the United States Attorney's Office for Oregon. Of those 110 people, about half, 55, are lawyers. The rest are support folks that do a whole range of critical functions to make our jobs work. We're in 3 offices here in Oregon, mostly up here in Portland, but we also have 3 attorneys down in Medford and the balance in Eugene, Oregon. We handle about 6 to 7 criminal cases in any given year, involving 750 to 950 criminal defendants with about 1,000 criminal cases pending at any given time. We have about 700 civil cases pending at any time. They range from torts against the government, challenges to forest management plans, and challenges to denials of Social Security benefits. But let's talk about the meat of the matter, the meat of the matter behind those statistics. When I took this job back in February of this year, I started focusing our team on a couple of key priorities. First, I wanted to get us out of the Willamette Valley more. Sure, this is where the major population centers are, but there are important federal crimes happening all over the state, and I wanted to get us out more to looking at those crimes and doing what we could in those communities. This is especially important in this devastating budget environment for everybody in state and county government and law enforcement from our perspective. So we're trying to get out and help DA's offices. My efforts to get us out of the valley more have led to some unusual results, including me being the, I think, very first United States attorney in Oregon to ever ride in the Pendleton Roundup parade on horseback. This caused great nervousness among the FBI agent who provided the horse, but it all worked out fine. I've also set priorities for tackling the drug overdose deaths in the state of Oregon, which we'll talk about more. I've tried to make it so that we get ahead and stay ahead on financial crimes. We're working to combat what is expanding and very frightening gang violence here and elsewhere. I've worked to maintain our leadership on environmental crimes, to expand our civil enforcement program, and to continue effective civil defense for fair and just results in civil cases. So let me give you a couple specifics and talk about a couple areas in particular. One of the biggest surprises to me since I took this job is to learn the overdose fatality rate in this state. Nearly 400 Oregonians die every year of drug overdoses. To put that in perspective, we have about 80 murders. So 5 times as many people die of drug overdoses as die in murders. There are 2 very different problems here. One is overdoses from illegal drugs like heroin and methamphetamines. The other is overdoses from prescription drugs, the Oxycontin or Vicodin or fentanyl that is probably in your medicine cabinet, and if not yours, then your neighbor's. Each of these problems kill about 200 people a year. It might surprise you to learn that overdoses from the lawful drugs kill nearly as many people as those from unlawful drugs. And of course, the drugs are just the tip of the iceberg. Many people overdose with long-term consequences for themselves and their own health without dying and leave lasting impacts in their families as well. So let me tell you about what we're trying to do with each of these problems. First of all, let's start with the illegal drug overdoses. This is a terrible problem. I meet all too regularly with the parents of kids who die from heroin overdoses. And it's just devastating. Moms like Tony Macy, who lost her son Joshua Reeves July a year ago. These families do everything they can to support their child and to get their child off these awful drugs. And then one day, their child is gone. So here's what we're doing. We're going after the organizations that are responsible for bringing these drugs into our community and killing these people. Back in 1986, an unbelievably talented basketball player at the University of Maryland named Len Bias got a contract was signed by the Boston Celtics, and that night went out and for the first time tried cocaine, and his heart exploded, and he died. This caught Congress's attention. And 2 years later, Congress passed what is now known as the Len Bias Act. The Len Bias Act makes it a 20-year mandatory minimum felony to be in the distribution chain of narcotics that kill someone, of illegal drugs that kill someone. It is an extremely forceful weapon. It used to be that drug overdose fatalities were treated as accidental deaths. Nobody called the police, they called the medical examiner and the family, and it was understood as a tragedy, which of course it is. But we have started teaming up with local law enforcement to treat these tragedies as the crime scenes that they are. So when we find a death, when a death happens, and take, for example, the case of Joshua Reeves, his mother, Tony, had been very worried about him and had been paying very close attention to him. And when he died, the police were called in, and they picked up his cell phone. And they worked backwards from his cell phone. And gradually, they worked up the food chain until 3 or 4 rungs later, they had identified 2 leaders of a major drug trafficking organization that were responsible for bringing into the United States the heroin that killed Joshua Reeves. What's more, within a couple of months, investigators learned that these same drug traffickers had brought in heroin that had killed a man named Patrick McGinnis just 6 months before, totally unconnected to the Joshua Reeves homicide, except that both of these drug traffickers provided the drugs. We took this case federally and prosecuted these 2 drug traffickers, people who in the drug trafficking world were considered untouchable. And now they're facing sentences, lengthy prison terms in federal prison in the neighborhood of 13 to 15 years. Part of the goal here is deterrence, of course, and there are signs that it is working. 2 Aprils ago, or no, excuse me, it was last April, a college student named Sam Tepper died of a heroin overdose in Southeast Portland. And when police arrested the man who sold Sam Tepper his heroin, the first thing he said was, "Don't Len Bias me." That's deterrence. That's effectiveness. So we are expanding our Len Bias initiative and hoping to bring down that number of 200 down as quickly as we can. We're looking to other counties where we can expand the program. Any county that has had multiple illegal drug homicides in the last couple of years, we're planning to launch that initiative. The prescription drug deaths are a more complicated and more novel challenge. Modern pharmaceuticals play a vital role in saving lives, alleviating pain, and making people better. But the prescription drug abuse crisis is growing, and all too often ends in fatalities. What terrifies me is that prescription drug abuse is becoming all the rage in young culture. If you go to YouTube and search for videos on the Oxycontin song, you will find posting after posting of teenagers singing the lyrics of songs glorifying prescription drug abuse into their webcam, plainly strung out, and posting them onto the web for others to see. Often it is a teenage girl, and in the background is her big fluffy bed with her big fluffy pink pillows and stuffed animals, and it is just heart-rending to see the direction this child is headed. If we don't get a handle on this, the 200 deaths is going to look like something we wish we still had. So last week, Governor Kulongoski and Attorney General Kroger and I joined together to invite the CEOs of the major pharmaceutical companies who make these drugs to come to a summit on prescription drug abuse in Oregon, so that together we can talk about the nature of this problem and try and get our hands on some solutions. The Oregon Partnership is taking the lead on this with us, providing important insights and helping organize it. The White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, the Drug Czar, is co-sponsoring it along with the district attorneys and others. It is a big deal. We hope to get these folks together, understand the problem better, and try and find some solutions. We're also working closely with both the Multnomah County Commission and the Portland City Council to defeat human trafficking. Commissioner Shiprack and McKeel are here. Commissioner McKeel has in particular been especially vocal and effective in working on defeating human trafficking. Commissioner Saltzman here in the city is working closely with her, and they're working closely with a congressional delegation. Slavery is alive and well today in the United States, in Oregon, right now, 85 blocks that way. And I'm not talking about some metaphorical slavery. I'm talking about human bondage in every sense, coercion, abuse, inability to escape. We are consistently high on the national lists for our human trafficking here, and we're trying to do something about it. Girls and young women enticed or induced through drug use, through violence, or threats to sell themselves, all for money to go to someone else. The commissioners and the congressional delegation have worked very hard to tackle this problem, from trying to fund efforts to support victims, funding John schools, and to educating people through a Stop the Demand campaign this summer. For our part, we are working to punish these people, to punish the traffickers, and to send the message that in Oregon we will not tolerate this modern form of slavery. Prosecuting guys like Jefferson Davis, whom we've charged with abducting a 13-year-old girl from Portland, prostituting her in Nevada, in Washington, in California, beating her severely, threatening to kill her family if she went to police, until finally, exasperated after months and months of enslavement, she begged a police officer to arrest her. He now faces a 15-year minimum prison sentence if convicted at trial. We're also working with local district attorneys and the Attorney General to address domestic violence. One of the tragedies of domestic violence, of course, is its cyclical nature. It comes back over and over again. One of the tools we have criminally on the federal system is our gun statutes, which make it illegal for someone convicted of a domestic violence assault charge, or who has a restraining order against them, to possess a gun. It's a felony. You go to jail for this. So I was out in Eastern Oregon earlier this summer at the Crook County Rodeo, and I asked a local prosecutor who does these cases, "Are you familiar with this statute?" Well, no, actually what I said was, "Do you have guys who are kind of repeat offenders?" "Yes." Are they guys who have past domestic violence assaults? "Yes." "Would you like to deal with them?" "Yes." "Do they carry guns?" "Honey, everybody here carries a gun." And I asked her if she knew about the statute, and she did. So we're doing, together with the Oregon Law Center and Aaron Grunewald in the Attorney General's office, we're working on beefing up our training program so people know both that these crimes are available and how to lay the predicates in the state with the misdemeanor assault prosecutions and temporary restraining orders so that we can actually come after them later on. Not all of the crimes we do are of the blood and guts variety, as we call them in our world. Combating fraud is one of our key priorities. And mortgage fraud and real estate fraud that helped create the economic crisis we're in continue to be an important part of our work. In the first 6 months of this case, this year, we indicted, pled, or sentenced mortgage fraud cases worth nearly $110 million. Last week alone, we indicted 2 cases with losses totaling over $20 million, and that is not a surprising week. The trick with fraud cases is to stay ahead of the curve, to be on top of next year's fraud now. So long ago, early this year, I should say, we began focusing on workout fraud. This is the lowest of the low as far as I'm concerned. People who take advantage of people who are about to lose their homes by telling them, don't worry, I can get you a better rate. And in fact, what they're selling is a reverse mortgage or a rate that lasts for 6 months and goes up to the moon. I get these solicitations almost every day, and they almost all look like they are addressed to me personally from the Secretary of the Treasury. They're hiding them as government-sponsored programs. We're trying to get a handle on that, stay ahead of that, and prosecute those people before they can do more harm. We don't just go after defendants, we also go after their money in criminal cases to try and get the money back into the hand of the victims of these crimes. We are lucky to have in our office a national treasure. Leslie Westphal is the leading expert in this nation on asset forfeiture. It is unbelievable how good her team is at doing this. It's not surprising, because of Leslie and her team, that we are nationwide leaders in asset forfeiture and in getting restitution into the hands of victims. In the last 5 years, we have recovered over $69 million from criminal defendants. Most of this money goes directly to victims of crime. $49 million of that $69 million went to victims of crime. The other $20 million is in civil recovery, and this number is growing. In the years 2002 to 2006, the average criminal forfeiture was $4 million a year. In the last 4.5 years, it's been $10 million a year. Environmental crimes remain a major priority for us. Karen Immerget, my predecessor and a fantastic United States attorney who is now a judge here in Multnomah County, asked me when I joined the office in 2004 to launch an environmental crimes initiative. And we did 3 things. First of all, we started taking more cases. We've gone from a couple of cases a year to 8 or 10 cases a year at any given time. Second, we launched a clinic at Lewis and Clark Law School to try and train new lawyers how to do this work and to get them enthusiastic about it. They also serve as a force multiplier for us. They do the kind of cases that we would like to do but really don't have the resources to do. And thirdly, under Karen's leadership, we've worked very hard to put criminal polluters' money to work on environmental projects in Oregon. We created 2 different funds to do this. One, the Governor's Fund for the Environment with Governor Kulongoski, and 2, the Endangered Species Justice Fund over at the zoo. The Governor's Fund works mainly on industrial pollution. The Justice Fund works mainly on wildlife crimes. And here's what happens to the money. Every time when a criminal defendant convicted of an environmental crime is sentenced, we ask the judge to send a portion of the monetary penalty in that case to one of these funds. Now, we don't control where the money goes because we want to keep distance from that. Rather, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation administers the grant fund and does a competitive grant series every year, or a grant call every year, for environmental projects that match the kind of harm caused by the defendants. We've put $6 million in that fund in the 5-6 years it's existed. And every year, they grant out between $300,000 and $500,000. And the grants go to an incredibly diverse range of projects. It'll go to educating farmers at Grange Halls in Yamhill County. Or one of my favorite of the projects, just because it's easy to explain to people, Salmon Safe. Salmon Safe is an organization that helps farmers figure out better ways to do their work that have less impact on the environment. And in particular, what Salmon Safe has done with grants from the Governor's Fund is clean up vineyards. They have made over 180 vineyards in the Willamette Valley salmon safe through grants from the Governor's Fund. This involves both cleaning up the inputs, choosing better pesticides and things like that, but also helping them install things like bioswales on the outputs. So the water going into the river after it's used in agriculture is cleaner. Next, they're moving to hops and have begun a hop farmer project, as I understand it. If you want to know what vineyards there are, by the way, they have a handy-dandy card, which I can show you, but also you can just go to salmonsafe.org and find the 180 vineyards that have cleaned up, and I suggest you might want to, if you drink, try a bottle of that kind of wine. But this is just one example. The best thing about the Governor's Fund is that the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, which runs it, leverages the governor's fund money to get more money. So last year they spent about $500,000 of governor's fund money and yet made $3 million worth of grants. They got a 6-to-1 match out of the money that we got from criminals in this state. I was surprised to learn in taking this office that we are a leading federal face in tribal communities. The United States Department of Justice is a leading partner with the 9 sovereign nations in this state. And it is a priority for this president and this attorney general to do our job better in working with those sovereign communities. So I've had a fantastic time, frankly, working on a broad range of issues with tribes. They range from small issues to large issues. The Silettes have been having problems with a misunderstanding from some law enforcement officers when they try and go take mussels in the Yaquina Bay. Well, they have treaty rights to do that. And there's a misunderstanding somewhere, we're fixing it. They shouldn't be hassled for taking mussels that they have a treaty right to take. We've established a HIDA at the Warm Springs, on the Warm Springs Reservation, a high-intensity drug trafficking area task force that we are expecting very promising results from with the great folks in law enforcement at Warm Springs. And out on the Umatilla reservations, when I was there recently, we heard concerns about relationships with the community. We've brought in the Community Relations Service from the United States Department of Justice that is going to be working very hard to try and reduce tensions where they are there out in Umatilla County and with the folks on the Umatilla Reservation. The single most surprising thing to me, in the time I've been in this job, is that 50% of the work I do as the United States Attorney is on terrorism and national security efforts. I was asked once by Dave Angeli, a member of the Defense Bar, well, that's true everywhere, right? No, that is not true everywhere. We are in a group that is more like us, Brooklyn, Chicago, Michigan, and Northern Virginia. The public record is replete with examples of the kinds of work we are doing. For example, someone was just convicted down in Eugene a couple of weeks ago for sending $150,000 from Egypt to England to Ashland, back to Saudi Arabia, from whence the money went to Chechnya to support folks around the Chechen terrorists that were fighting the Russian government at the time. What is surprising to me is how much the United States Attorney has to personally engage in these terrorism and national security efforts. As is clear in public filings from the summer, we have been very engaged, or I was very engaged this summer, in a very high level to obtain bank records from a Saudi bank for the case I mentioned a moment ago. Using a little-known authority created after September 11th, we subpoenaed records from a foreign bank, from a Saudi bank. Now, this bank is the 3rd largest bank in Saudi Arabia and did not voluntarily provide the records. So it required a great deal of litigation and effort, and it required direct personal involvement by me in order to be able to get this evidence in support of the trial team. But the more common and more prominent area where I am personally engaged heavily in terrorism and national security cases is in trying to help strike the balance between the needs of the criminal justice system and the very sensitive needs of the intelligence community. I believe fundamentally, as a matter of our Constitution and of our freedom, that the United States Department of Justice should be and can be a critical player in our efforts to combat terrorism. Since the September 11th, the Department of Justice, through civilian courts, open courts, public prosecutions, with criminal defense lawyers and all of the other attached liberties, we have taken over 400 criminals out of circulation in terrorism-related cases. We've incapacitated terrorists, we've stopped plots, and perhaps most importantly, we've developed cooperating witnesses who tell us information about other plots and other bad guys who are out there. This shouldn't be surprising that the Department of Justice plays such a critical role. After all, it was a federal prosecutor, not a spy, who was the first American to hear the words Al-Qaeda. It was Pat Fitzgerald, who is now my colleague from the United States Attorney's Office in the Northern District of Illinois, and you may know him better as the prosecutor of Scooter Libby. Pat was the first American to ever hear the words Al-Qaeda. So the criminal justice system must and can and must be a prime weapon in our efforts to defeat terrorism, but it's complicated. Striking the balance between constitutional protections, where we have to turn over and should turn over and must turn over to defense lawyers information important to them to be able to do their jobs and represent their clients effectively, have to be worked in an environment where the intelligence community is very sensitive with the disposition of classified information. And that is where, as the United States Attorney, I have been personally engaged to an extent I would never have guessed at. Helping trial assistants work with the intelligence community to ensure that we can make the disclosures we need to make in order to ensure that defendants get a fair trial while continuing to pursue these cases effectively. As I mentioned, we have a substantial civil docket as well, with a number of assistants who do great work in defense of the United States. These cases run an unbelievable gamut from massive tort cases to tort cases involving claims of medical malpractice at the VA to trees falling in the national forest on cars. Twice since I have become United States Attorney, a tree has fallen on a car in the national forest, and there has been some suggestion or prospect that the United States was liable for this. We also have an affirmative civil program, and one of the ones in the program I want to highlight is our civil rights program, which is growing. We've begun small. We've done fair housing cases, public accommodation cases, but I know from the model of environmental enforcement that you start small with these cases, the agencies and people become aware you're doing these, and the cases go from being small cases to being very big cases. Cases like a guy named Frank Armstrong, a blind vet who likes to volunteer here at the Veterans Administration Hospital. But he doesn't live here. So when he comes to Portland, he has to stay at a hotel. Well, he presented his state-issued identification at a hotel not too long ago and asked for a room and was told that he could not have a room unless he produced an Oregon driver's license. He's blind. He does not have an Oregon driver's license, nor could he get an Oregon driver's license. And yet, Mr. Armstrong ended up spending the night on the floor of the volunteer room at the VA hospital because he could not get this hotel to accommodate him. Well, Adrian Brown in our office took that case. It was too small a dollar for a private lawyer to take, I guess, and was able to obtain some relief and get some relief going forward so that the hotel, which is obviously prepared to take responsibility and move forward and fix this going forward, wouldn't have this problem again. I also think that it is critical if we're going to be effective members of the community to undertake the kind of community change that we expect non-government players to engage in. Let me talk about a couple. Diversity and sustainability. At the Attorney General's direction, all the United States Attorney's offices have developed diversity plans. We have a very active diversity committee in my office, and I'm working on the convocation on equality for 2011 event next year. But I think that at the heart of diversity, which is, to me, critical to doing our jobs right? We understand witnesses and understand cases and understand the challenges of humans, which are so present before us, only if we have a sensitive understanding of diversity. I think the most important thing is getting folks in my office out to meet people that they wouldn't normally meet in their lives. So I've been working very closely with various diversity bars from here. I see Conchetta Swessinger from OWLS. I've worked very closely with the National Hispanic Bar Association folks, with the Oregon Association of Pacific American Bar Association. And I think we're making real steps. We've had some socials. It's been fun, frankly, to get people out of their normal tracks in my office so they see other sides of what's going on. My criminal chief, Bill Williams, was recently selected for the board of the Urban League, and I'm thrilled about it because it gets us out into the community more. And thanks to the hiring of my predecessors, Karen and Kent Robinson and Mike Mossman, all great United States attorneys, they created a great farm system for me So that we've been able to do some really remarkable things in the 8 months I've been there. We have tripled the number of women on the management team and named the first woman ever as chief of the violent crime section in our office. And we added Kelly Zussman, who is here today as chief of our appellate section. We've made tremendous progress, and I'm really pleased to be able to do it. I frankly was there at the right time based on my predecessors having made it possible for me. Finally, on sustainability, we are, I think, probably one of the first offices in the country to establish a green team where we're looking for ways to do better with sustainability in our office. We've had our green audit. We're getting ready to figure out what from that we can implement, and we're doing everything we can. I want to end where I started and talk about gang violence as an example. We are an agent, we are and must be an agent of positive community change. We make communities safer, but all too often we show up when the damage is done, right? We're there too late. And that's why I tell people, we in law enforcement can't solve these big problems. We are all too often treating the symptoms, not the problem. The solutions are in broader community efforts. Take gang violence as an example. As you've probably heard, we've stepped up our anti-gang work statewide. We're working with the mayor and Commissioner and Chief Reese and Mike Shrunk on stepping up gang enforcement here in town. But I was at a community meeting a couple weeks ago, and it shows how tricky this problem is and how it's really a community problem. We're in a room with a bunch of people from the community, and there are two very distinct voices. There's one set of voices that wants people locked up so their kids and grandkids can play in the city parks. And there's one set of folks who says adamantly that incarceration is not the answer. They are both right. We have a public safety need. We have to do our job. We have to get some people off the street. But the real solution is not incarceration. The real solution is community problems. We need to get people jobs so that they can support their families and be a role model and be a force for moral authority as they're raising their kids. We need to make schools the cool place to be. Boy, you know, if you go out to Lake Ridge, I would never leave that place if I was a student there. It is a great place. I would not need to be in a mall. I would not need to be on a corner. I would be there. And we need to target resources to needs better, whether it's teaching folks how to be better parents, whether it's case management of folks with healthcare needs, whether it's the kind of reentry program and intensive management of folks as they come out of prison so that they stay out of prison, not just for them, but for us in the community as well. I met Andre Payton's mother and grandmother 2 Fridays ago, little Andre who was killed in gun violence a few weeks, maybe a month ago now, and to look these folks in the eye and tell them we're going to help, we have to be ready to help with the broader community problems, with the broader community solutions. We in the United States Attorney's Office stand ready to join in being a part of the solutions. Thank you very much.
The first question for our speaker, as always, will be from our Friday Forum host. Our host today is City Club Governor and Treasurer Ted Kaye. Ted Kaye is serving as the City Club Governor and Treasurer and has for several years. He's been a member at the club since 1990 and received the City Club President's Award in both 2008 and in 2009. Ted.
Thank you, Melody. So my question, toward the end of the Bush administration, there was a big to-do about the dismissal of U.S. attorneys for political reasons. The positions taken by both sides of the debate seemed a bit disingenuous to me. So are U.S. attorneys solely political appointees serving at the pleasure of the current administration? Or are they career professionals whose continued service depends on merit? Or is the answer somewhere in between?
Let me begin by saying that we in the Department of Justice, those of us who actually are prosecutors and the defense lawyers who make up, and the support people too, who do this work, were unbelievably appalled at what happened in the last administration. And I should say that nearly every one of the political appointees of the Bush administration was absolutely appalled at it. It was stunning to us. As I said at the beginning of my talk, our credibility is our most important asset. It has taken generations to build up the kind of trust we have so that when we get up in court and say to a court or to a judge or to a jury, this is what happened, they believe us. And the notion that people would be put in these jobs because of politics, irrespective of merit, was nothing more than devastating. This is the God's honest truth. I didn't believe it. And remember, my political background will tell you that I'm not a Republican partisan in any way. I'm not a Republican. But when I heard this, I just said it's not true. And it took me a long time to believe it. Now, you're right that there are some subtleties here. But the answer is that while the policy direction of an office, which is set by the President, the Attorney General, and the U.S. attorneys, is something that is appropriately changes with elections, the core commitment to justice and integrity cannot. And what that means is, yes, you can put people with political backgrounds or political interest or policy interest in those jobs, so long as they are not put there because of their ideology. They must have a grounding and core of competence. And if you do that, then you'll be okay, I think.
We will now take questions from the floor. Asking questions at Friday Forums is a privilege of City Club membership. Before asking your question, please identify yourself as a City Club member and ask your questions in 30 seconds or less. If I flash this question mark, it means that you need to wrap up with your question. Thank you.
Yes, I'm Peter Fenner. I'm a member of City Club. My question is, with a little prologue, less than 30 seconds, that it seems to me that supply will always meet demand. And so I'm back into drugs and prostitution. It seems to me that if we went after the users and the Johns, if you will, and not necessarily to incarcerate them, but for significant fines, significant publicity, awareness in the community of who they are, their employers become aware of who they are, their parents become aware, and you also have a ton of cell phones to work your way up the channel. I don't know whatever happened to that notion, but the very people who get notoriety in this world, bands, singers, and so on, who are obviously on drugs, we don't go after them. They set a terrible example for everybody. They're in the lyrics of the songs that you talked about. So my question is, why don't we go after the users?
The human trafficking, and you're right, they're both supply and demand, human trafficking and drugs. They're different challenges, I think. So let's talk about human trafficking first. Education on human trafficking is a critical component to fixing it and stopping the demand. You know, we had a month, the Multnomah County Commission and City both declared a Stop the Demand month in July this month. And our tolerance in Oregon is one of our greatest characteristics. It's part of the reason we love this place and live here. It can be misplaced. And we need to stop tolerating this kind of, the Johns as well. The Multnomah County Commission is looking at a John school. I'm not sure where it is in the process. I think maybe it exists now. Commissioner McKeel is telling me she's attended it. Oh, she has, so that's a critical part of it that has to happen. The challenge is we don't generally prosecute Johns unless there's some significant aggravator federally. The Multnomah County District Attorney's Office does some, but it's a resource challenge. You've hit the nail on the head that education is the right fix there at that level, I think. On drug trafficking, you're also right. This is why I think of it as a community problem. To address the drug problem, we need to do treatment better. We need to treat it as a chronic illness that it is, so that we don't just do a quick treatment and walk away. We need to support the family members who are trying to help this person get back from the abyss. And we need to look at ways and trying to get folks employment so that they can step away from what they're doing. Those are better solutions and longer term, more effective solutions than just incarceration.
Well, you've backed away from the fact that you're not suggesting that we prosecute the users.
I think that's a matter of, yes, I think it's better to go after the users of drugs primarily through education. Incarceration is appropriate sometimes, I would say.
My name is Leonard Santos. I'm a member of the City Club. You mentioned the tension between prosecuting terrorists and the need to obtain intelligence. And one of the things that's not clear to me is what this administration and its law enforcement arm believes should be done with alleged terrorists. We had a case in the Bush administration of an American citizen whisked away from O'Hare Airport to a dungeon in South Carolina and held for about 4 years before he was finally actually prosecuted, denied due process of all sorts. Now, I'm not asking here about convicting these people. I'm really asking about how we go about determining whether a person that we believe should be denied the normal constitutional process is in fact an appropriate candidate. If in fact this person, if there's enough evidence to hold the person as a terrorist suspect. It's not clear to me what the current policy and law is on this. The Padilla case never made it to the Supreme Court. The administration apparently didn't want that precedent, so they prosecuted him for arms, basically, violations. So my question is basically, do you have a policy now as a U.S. attorney in dealing with people who are apprehended, who are alleged to be terrorists? Is there some evidentiary process that you follow to determine whether in fact the person is in fact a terrorist?
People who are arrested in the United States are dealt with in the criminal justice system, period. That is new. I recognize that. In other words, Jose Padilla is an example of someone, the person you referenced from, who was arrested in Chicago, who was a United States citizen arrested at an airport in Chicago and not prosecuted for years, as you point out. He was held as an enemy combatant at a brig in South Carolina. The Obama administration believes that we have different tools for different uses. And the Justice Department is one tool, the military is another tool, not for use in the United States, and the intelligence community is a third tool, not for use in the United States. But if you have someone arrested in the United States, we treat that criminally, period.
Just my question really is, what if he's not arrested? What if he's detained and it's not considered an arrest?
If it's
no such possibility?
There's no provision in the United States to detain someone without charging beyond 48 hours, I want to say. And
Thank you.
It's not I want to be clear, it's not a complete answer, because what happens with people abroad is, I think it's fair to say the administration is still trying to get their hands around it.
Carla Kelly, City Club member. Can you talk a little bit about how things are working in Oregon in the division between those things that go to your office and those things that go to the other state authorities? And I'd appreciate it if you'd address what's working really well and what needs a little more attention.
Okay. I think I'm trying to think of an example. Where'd you go, Carl? I'm trying to think of an example where things are not working so well, because we have a very close working relationship. Well, there you are. Sorry. Both with county district attorneys and with the Attorney General. I go monthly to the district attorney's meeting, but I'm on the phone and email with district attorneys all the time. I talked to Mike Shrunk this morning, Norm Frank's here. Those guys, I have those guys on speed dial, and that's true for most counties throughout the state. Kroger's my son's godfather. He knows how to find me if he needs me, and vice versa. So I think that we're doing pretty well, and we're open to any concerns about it. But that's a way, that is, by the way, unique to Oregon, in my experience in law enforcement. That was not so great in New York. And what's worse, the federal agencies didn't get along. You know, ATF and DEA didn't always sing and play well together in the sandbox in New York. That's just not true here. And I'm not sure if it's the water or if we're just lucky or what.
Steve Novick, City Club member. You talked about the complexity of the justice system and the issue of proper allocation of resources. When you have state prisons and county prosecutors, it seems to me that you can have a shortage of prosecutors, and that's not really the state's problem. But when the prosecutors are determining how long to try to send somebody to prison, they don't really have to think about the impact on the state budget. Can you imagine a system where the state sat down with each county and sort of worked out a comprehensive law enforcement budget where you had an attempt at a rational allocation of here's how much we should spend on prisons, here's how much on prosecution, here's how much on other public safety functions?
Here's the challenge that Steve's identifying. When when my state colleagues or county colleagues go into court and put someone in jail or seek to have someone convicted and get them convicted, and the judge puts him in jail for 10 years, the DA who undertook that prosecution and the chief of police who undertook that arrest, it's not their problem who pays for that guy to go to jail for 10 years. I mean, it's their problem as a citizen, but they don't have to figure it out in their budgeting. So the question, how do you have a sensible allocation of resources? If you've got one group creating costs without having to find the money to actually pay for it. So I don't have a good answer for it, Steve, other than that the Criminal Justice Commission and the DAs work very hard to try and understand and predict what's gonna happen. But one thing I think you can't do is bind judges based on budgets, because that's not, in my mind, an appropriate basis for determining what a sentence ought to be. So the way you set those priorities is by establishing the right ranges of imprisonment for people based on what you predict the conviction population will be. So if you're worried about your budget, you need to lower sentences or figure out alternatives to incarceration for certain classes of crime. I'm not recommending this, mind you, but if that's what your goal is in your budgeting, that's how you do it, I think, to get the message back to the DAs on the front end that drive those costs.
Edward Hershey, City Club member. With some unhappy exceptions that you cited relating to gangs and drugs, despite a terrible economy, crime is down here and across the country. What do you make of that? Is it demographics? Are we doing something right?
It is incredible. The difference between when I started as a baby prosecutor in Brooklyn and now is remarkable. There's a neighborhood that coincidentally, John Kroger and I were in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn together. And one of the neighborhoods we spend a bunch of time working on was Bushwick. And when I lived in Brooklyn, you would not get out of a car in Bushwick. You would be very unhappy if you found yourself in a car in Bushwick. One gang alone I prosecuted there had killed 10 people in 5 years. They owned a 4 square block area, period. So fast forward to 3 or 4 years ago, the New York City transit strike, when people were walking to work instead of taking the subway, and here's OPB's affiliate, WNYC, out interviewing people on the foot of the Brooklyn Bridge. And here are ad executives and lawyers and yuppies of all stripe being interviewed. Where do you live? I live in Bushwick. Those people wouldn't be caught dead in Bushwick. So the change is dramatic. On the one hand, I think that has a lot to do with the economy and the economic tide lifting all boats. But as Novick and Craig Prins, the director of the Criminal Justice Commission, and Mike Burton, who's a member, would probably tell me, it doesn't track, because there have been great economic times when we also had high crime rates. Craig, the executive director of the Criminal Justice Commission, thinks it's mostly tied to demographics. The more 18 to 35-year-old men you have, the more crime you have. But they've begun to identify some things that make some real difference. And one of them is this kind of intensive case management on the back end of people who are coming out of prison to make sure they can get jobs, to become self-sustaining, and to make sure that if they start to go south, you figure it out early before they do any real damage. So it's a mixed answer. I think demographics are a significant part of it, but we're starting to learn some things that actually work.
John Leeper, City Club member. I commend you for the work that you and your staff do. My question for you is, you speak about these crime rates, et cetera, in the state of Oregon. How does that compare with other states in the western United States as well as national averages?
It's a good question. On human trafficking, we are, when we do big national roundups, we are inevitably in the top 4 or 5 cities nationwide. On drug trafficking, we have a very significant drug trafficking problem, in part because of our location on I-5, in part because of our public lands. We are the involuntary landlord for drug trafficking organizations here in Oregon, who grow marijuana on, in the national forest and public lands. Those drugs are linked inextricably to methamphetamine and heroin. We don't see single drug organizations anymore. They're all what we call polydrug drug organizations. Marijuana grown on public land here is a cash crop for them that supports the heroin and meth operations. So I think that we are uniquely a part of that problem. The Attorney General did an allocation of new Assistant U.S. Attorneys for Southwest border work about 6 months ago, and we got one of those positions. We are not, as you may note, on the Southwest border, but we are very heavily impacted by Southwest border challenges because of these Mexican drug trafficking organizations that are coming here. And I think our overdose rate is pretty high nationally as well, both for the prescription drug side and the heroin side. Thank you.
We have unfortunately run out of time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for today. I hope you'll join us next week for a post-election analysis with David Saracen from The Oregonian and Bob Moore of More Information. As we close, please join me in expressing our deep appreciation to today's guest, Dwight Holton. Thank you. We are adjourned.